joined now by someone who has a long history in television, having started at the BBC in the early 80s, but more recently produced things like Casualty and EastEnders. As amongst all of this, though, he's worked with both children and animals, and as perhaps inevitably has come into contact with Doctor Who. So I would like to introduce production manager Michael Darbon. How are you?
Hello, how are you? I'm fine, thank you very much indeed. Actually, I'm going to correct you. I actually started at the BBC in 1978 as a floor assistant in the studio management department, and so I had around 30 years at the BBC because I left in 2008. So it's quite a while ago now, 12 years ago, yeah, it's I had a very varied career, as you said. In your introduction, and I was a production manager for a time, and a production manager, it sort of varied from department to department as what they did, but now the role of production manager in TV is slightly different to the one we did then, because we effectively did 3 jobs rolled into one. I mean, nowadays you would have a location manager, a production manager, and a first AD. Well, in those days, we did all of those jobs, the one person. So consequently, you know, I was responsible if we had to go look for locations or whatever. I'd be out on the road looking for locations. If I and setting those up, but I would be back in the studio or in the office. I would be scheduling the show and putting it together and working out, you know, how we were going to do it and liaising with other departments as to when and where they would be needed. And then, of course, when you're actually making the show itself, you'd be stood next to the director, or if it was a studio show like Doctor Who, they would be up in the gallery more often than not, and you would be directing the actors and the background action as a first assistant director would. So yeah, it's 3 jobs rolled into one, but of course these days, they don't have quite so much preparation time these days as we used to have then, because we didn't have the technology, the access to the technology. We had to do everything on ordinary phones or on typewriters, and we used to have to send memos in the post and letters and things like that, and then wait for answers to come back. And so you know, we had a lot more time in order to be able to work out how we were going to do things. These days, everything's done quickly, and as time is as a premium, very much so. So yes, I did come into contact with Doctor Who just the once in 1983, but it's a very memorable one.
So would that have been quite an early job for you then, in terms of actually being on a production?
Yeah, it was certainly a very early job for me as a production manager, because I actually came from I wasn't in the drama department at the time. I was in another department called studio management, which provided production staff for all the other departments apart from drama. Drama always had its own setup and its own group of AFMs and production managers, firsts, and people like that. They had their own people, their own staff, which they use within the department. With other departments like light entertainment, comedy, children's, schools, I worked for schools television a bit, they relied on studio management to provide the staffing for them. You know, we were like a booking service. And so consequently, I'd made a conscious decision that I wanted to go into the drama department. And in order to do that in those days, you had to have attachments. So you had to go to boards, various boards with the people in drama. You know, there'd be 3-4 people there all sat round, and they'd be firing questions at you left, right and centre, and then they'd decide whether or not you could have a 6-month attachment or whatever to the department in order to train as you know, for one of the roles in the drama department. And I managed initially to get an attachment to a department called drama plays, because in those days it used to be drama plays, drama series and drama serials. There were 3 separate departments. And I got an attachment to drama plays, and I worked there for 6 months and did a couple of plays for them. Had to go back to my own department, where I think I might have been working on something like the Kenny Everett show or something like that. And then I got a call to say drama series would like you to come and join them. And I went across and I did a police series called Juliet Bravo. which in those days was filmed up in Burnley. So I spent time up in Burnley doing that, and that went quite successfully. So they said, "Would you like to stay on? We've got a Doctor Who you'd like to do," and that Doctor Who was Warriors of the Deep, which is, you know, one of the most infamous or famous Doctor Who's ever made. My only one. I don't know if it's. I would have done more. I would have been quite happy to do more, but obviously I went off and did lots of other things. And sometimes when you're, you know, you get into a sort of circle or cycle, it's very difficult to get back to doing things like, you know, Doctor Who. You know, so actually I never went back to do them. It wasn't because I didn't want to. I remained on friendly terms with John Nathan Turner and June Collins, who was the production associate at the time, is still a good friend. You know, I still occasionally meet up for drinks and reminiscences, and we send each other Christmas cards. So, you know, it was just fate, really. You get onto a different cycle, a different wheel, and you go off in a different direction. So, yeah, Warriors of the Deep was a baptism of fire as far as Doctor Who was concerned.
Because you were saying before we started recording that it was perhaps particularly memorable because of the general election and various scheduling issues. That must have been a first for you, surely.
I think it was a first for quite a few people, because it, you know, general elections tended only to come around every 4 or 5 years, and so consequently, I mean, they were impossible to avoid. They were juggernauts, and they bulldozed their way through general elections. Everything. So everything had to get out the way and clear the path for the general election that was coming. And though even if the general election, I think the general election was probably in sometime in May, they were usually in May, towards the end of May or whatever, you know, and our studios just happened to be in the same week in the same studios they wanted for the general election in 1983. This was the one that was called suddenly. It was not expected, but it came very soon after the Falklands War, which was in 1982. And so, you know, Margaret Thatcher wanted to consolidate on her popularity at the time and increase her majority. And she knew she was up against Michael Foot. You know, it was very similar to the Jeremy Corbyn situation we've just had. Very, very similar. And so consequently, she thought, that's the time I'm going to go. And so, you know, Maggie Thatcher ruined Doctor Who. Amongst other things, but she being a bit political there, but she she called the election, and it meant that news and current affairs took over. They took over the studio, and it meant we got booted out, and the only direction they could find for us to go was forward rather than backwards. And in coming forward, it meant that we lost preparation time. And for Doctor Who, you know, which is not it was never a well budgeted show. I mean, it is now, but in those days, you know, it was done on the cheap, effectively. And so consequently, in order to make them work, they needed their preparation time. That was what was important. And we lost that preparation time. And that meant that, you know, we either had the choice of, say, cancelling the whole thing altogether and losing that particular episode, or taking the slot that they gave us 2 weeks earlier in a smaller studio, which meant that we had a huge, massive set. And it meant it wouldn't fit into the studio we were given, so we had to do it in 2 blocks. And we lost Ealing Studios, where we were going to do which belonged to the BBC at the time. They were our studios, and so consequently we then had to go outside to Shepperton Studios in order to do all the stuff in the tank, because there wasn't a tank in the television centre. We needed a water tank, so we had to go to Shepperton, which actually turned out to be an advantage in the end, because I know in those days, when you went outside to outside studios, film studios like Ealing, you couldn't shoot on video. They didn't allow you to shoot video. You had to shoot on film. And of course, in the studio, we shot on multi-camera video tape. So the one advantage we gained was that by going to Shepperton Studio, who said, yes, you can shoot on video, you don't have to shoot on film, 16mm film, it meant that you could actually you know, shoot the whole thing so it has a homogeneous look.
So how was the director, Pennant Roberts, drawing all of this? Did he sort of welcome in and take it in his stride?
I know Pennant was very pleased at the time, in a sense, that he was going to Shepperton, because A, he lived quite close by, and B, it was a much better look for the series. So the episode. So it was better in that sense. But that was probably the only advantage. From every other aspect, it was disastrous. Especially for the costume department, and who had all these multiple Silurians and Sea Devils costumes and everything to make, which must have taken ages. And then visual effects department, they came under pressure because there was this ongoing argument between the costume department and visual effects as to who was going to be responsible for the Myrka. And the Myrka, as you probably know, is this monster. I mean, it's a monster in every sense of the word, but it's this monster that it has the look of a pantomime horse, but with a sort of horrible bulging eyes and bits of seaweed dripping off it and all the rest of it. And the costume said, that's no way is that a costume, and visual effects said, well, that's no way it's a visual effect. And so for ages, there was this impasse when nobody was taking responsibility for it, and we were running out of time. We'd come forward, we had no time, this Myrka had to be made. And so in the end, visual effects lost and they had to make it, but they had to make the whole thing in a week. And then we had no one to operate it. And so, because I came from children's department, I'd worked in children's department, I knew that there were these two guys who were involved in Rent-A-Ghost, which was a children's series at the time. And they played a pantomime horse in Rent-A-Ghost. So I suggested to in the office to Pennant, I said, well, there are these two guys who play a pantomime horse in Rent-A-Ghost. Maybe we could use them. And we checked them out, and they weren't filming that particular week. And so we booked the two guys from Rent-A-Ghost to come in and play the pantomime horse, play the pantomime Myrka, basically, to do the same thing. But of course they did know because it wasn't built, they had no time for fittings, they had no time to rehearse in it. I mean, the first time they came near it was on the first day of the shoot. They just had to get into it, and we had to shoot it then and there. And visual effects hadn't finished it, so they were rushing around the studio as this thing was lumbering around the studio, painting it with green paint. So, and it was wet. So every time any of the actors, extras or whatever, went near it, they got covered in green paint. It was horrendous. I remember. I remember Tegan, Janet Fielding, having to fall on top of the Myrka at one point when it was dead. They killed it, and she came rush. The whole thing was based on running around corridors, as most Doctor Who's were. And she came running around, had to fall on top of the Myrka, which she did, of course, and she came up covered in green paint. And we had about 3 minutes on the clock to finish, and we had no time to get her clean or whatever. It was incredible. The pressure of that. We did overrun. I do remember. I have to say we overran. Which you're never supposed to do in the studio. You had to plead, particularly with the electricians. If you were overrunning, you had to go. The first thing you had to do was go to the chief electrician and say, "Please, can we have some more time?" And they would look at you down their glasses, like that, and say, "Okay." And they'd look at their watch and whatever, and then of course they would look at their wallet and they'd be thinking overtime and all that sort of thing because it costs. So yeah, we got the time. We managed to do it, but I do remember that the last half an hour of that Doctor Who being Pennant came down on the floor from the studio, and he just say, run down that corridor, fall over there, shoot that gun there, And he said, I'll just put it all together in the editing, Which he did, bless him.
I believe it was during the production of that story that both Janet Fielding and Peter Davison expressed their desire to move away from the show. Were you aware of that at the time? Did it perhaps influence the atmosphere on set?
No, not at all in terms of the atmosphere. The atmosphere on set, I seem to remember, was actually quite cordial throughout. I mean, it was I didn't really get too involved at that level, and actually I knew Peter already. I'd worked with Peter the year before, actually before he became, might have been 2 years before he became Doctor Who. he did a series called Sink or Swim, a comedy series, which was with well-known actor now Robert Glenister, and they played two brothers, and it was filmed. We filmed it up in Newcastle, most of it. So I knew Peter already, and was on pretty friendly terms with him because he's a little bit older than me, but he's not grossly older than me. And so we got on rather well. So when it came to set, it felt very relaxed. And Janet was good fun. She was quite good fun to work with or whatever. So I don't think they ever, and they knew that it wasn't any, the crews and everybody working with them were working as hard as they possibly could. Their outlook was very professional. They just knew they had to get it done. Politically behind the scenes, yes, they may well have thought. I mean, I'm sure if they thought I've got to escape before Warriors of the Deep, they certainly thought that afterwards. I'd probably agree with that. but they both had the whole of that. That was the first episodes of that series, I think. They were the first ones. So consequently, they still had the whole series to get through, which was another 6 months filming probably in order to get the series made, in order it to be the series. It went out in 1994, that series. 1984. And so consequently, they knew they had to get to at least to the end of that before they could pull the plug, basically. No, so no, it was fine. And the other actors, I mean, Tom Adams, who played the commander, was a bit grand. Let's put it like that. I mean, he was fine. He was very professional, but he had slight delusions of grandeur, I think. But someone like Ingrid Pitt, who had done a huge number of horror films and was a Hammer horror regular and things like that, you'd expect someone like that to be a bit of a diva because of their background. But actually, she was delightful. She was really funny, very good fun, very relaxed, laughed a lot, made jokes. She was great. And really, really easy to work with, and the majority of them were. I mean, the most difficult thing I remember on that series. I mean, I was, one of the reasons I became a production manager is because I was quite organised and quite, detailed in my planning and whatever. And I remember thinking, right, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to work out, all these extras. I think I had about 12 sea devils and half a dozen Silurians or something like that. And I'm going to give them all numbers and plot them into this. So I knew exactly which sea devils and which Silurians I was going to have in which scene and how they would go. So I worked it all out. And so I gave, instead of using names, I gave them all a number to say, so I want Sea Devil 5, 7, and 8 over there. I want Silurian 1, 9, 3, and 5, whatever over there. And I thought this will work. But of course, the minute they put the costumes on, I couldn't tell one from another. I hadn't got a clue. And they couldn't breathe, they couldn't hear, they couldn't see, which is why most of the time they're staggering around. They stagger from corridor scene to scene. So basically, they're staggering around because they can't see, they can't breathe, and basically they're just trying to find, I must go as fast as I can, get out of the shot so I can take this bloody head off. So my numbering system went totally out of sync and out the window, and he just said, go over there, please go, run down there. And it didn't matter who was going where. It didn't really matter at all because they all looked exactly the same. You couldn't tell one from another. It was a very strange way of doing things, but
So after all of the complications involved in making a Doctor Who, did it prepare you well for anything else the BBC could throw at you?
Well, they threw at me Scott Fitzgerald's Tender as the Night next, because after I'd done Doctor Who, I went back to my old department for a very short period of time, and then I got a call to say we're doing boards for production managers in series and serials. By that time, it becomes series and serials, and I went for the board and passed and got it. So I was made permanent in series and serials at that particular point. So at the end of 1983, so the end of the same year. And the first thing they gave me was Tender as the Night, the Scott Fitzgerald film series, which was 6 episodes, all of it film abroad, the whole lot. We didn't do anything in the UK. And that was mainly because we used American actors in the main roles, Hollywood actors. We used people like Mary Steenburgen was in it, and John Hurd, and Piper Laurie. There were all sorts of American actors in it, and I had a smattering of French. I could understand some French and speak a bit, not a huge amount, but enough to go on holiday and go to the shops and go to the restaurant. And suddenly they said, well, you're going to be location manager for France for Tender as the Night. So I got dispatched for France. So I went out of the frying pan into the fire, basically, because I spent most of the next year, I spent 9 months of the next year abroad in France and in Switzerland, where we filmed the other half of it. But even that had its problems because, I don't know, I think there was a delay in the scripts. Dennis Potter had adapted the scripts from the Scott Fitzgerald novel, and there was a delay in receiving it. And Tender as the Night is structured in a way that it's dependent on the seasons. So the 4 seasons are represented in the book, summer, winter, autumn, spring. And so consequently, Margot Hayhoe was the production manager on it. I was, location manager with a guy called Jeremy Wolfe, who was the location manager for Switzerland, and we're all good friends still. And we had to, everything was planned according to the season. So the scenes were structured and where we were going in which time. So it meant that we would go to Switzerland when it was snowing, so we could do ski scenes. It meant that we would go to to the south of France to shoot the beach scenes when it was summer and it was warm and they could go in the sea. As soon as you shift the schedule, the scripts get delayed and you have to shift on. Oh, there's a 6-week delay. We're going to shift everything on 6 weeks. It meant that nothing hit the right points in the schedule. It meant that we went to the south of France in the Mistral season in the south when you get these winds coming up. And it meant every time we put our set up on the beach, which is all these wonderful tents and everything, they blew away. We come back the next morning and our set was floating in the sea. We'd have to be getting it in. It meant we'd end up in Switzerland when there was no snow. It meant we went to Paris, and I looked after Paris as well. Oh, my Google Assistant has just started up. Shut it up. It meant that we went to Paris in midwinter, which was meant to be set in August in Paris. Because Paris at the time, in Paris, we were meant to shoot it in August because Paris emptied out at August. All Parisians went on holiday in August and disappeared to the coast. And so we were trying to avoid the Parisians on the coast for the coast scenes and in Paris in the winter. And we hit Paris in I think it was the worst winter since 1898 or something. It was absolutely perishing. And it snowed and it snowed. And this is meant to be August. We're meant to be seeing people out in their shirt sleeves and all the rest of it. And we were shooting in January or something. And the snow came down. We had to do a lot of filming at the cemeteries, the military cemeteries from the First World War. Because a lot of it we filmed around, but as well as Paris, we had to go north to Picardy and Normandy and shoot around the sort of the First World War, the Somme Valley and those sort of places, and go to the war graves basically. But we got to the war graves and we couldn't see them, and we couldn't see the war graves because the snow was 6 feet high and they were underneath the snow. And so we had people out there shoveling away the snow and everything in order to be able us to film the war graves and things like that. Everything hit the wrong season. So how we made that work, I don't know. I do remember the diesel lorries that we had parked up in Paris froze. It was so cold, the diesel in the lorries froze, and you used to get the guys in the morning used to be, God knows how dangerous it is, but they used to go out and light fires underneath the diesel tanks in order to melt the diesel in order so they could drive the lorries. God knows, they could have blown the whole of Paris up, I suspect. It's like lighting a bomb.
So I suppose the BBC at the time must have been a fantastic place to work. You're across so many different shows. Each day was different. It must have been a real joy to work there.
As I said in our preamble, that every day was different, and you never quite knew what was around the corner. Something else would crop up. It never. You started off doing something, and it never quite ended up how you expected or what you expected. But that was the fun of it. That was the joy of it. The joy of the unexpected, and being able to adapt. And that's what made you a good production manager or good ASM or good anything. Being able to adapt to the climate, the changes, the politics, all those sort of things that were going on around you, all influenced the shows that you were doing and how you were doing them.
Having worked on all of these, I think, particularly challenging productions and obviously made a success of them, was it inevitable that you would go on to produce them?
No, it's never inevitable that you go on to produce at all. And in fact, I never produced as often as I felt I should have done or would have liked to have done. There was increasingly a dividing line that sort of developed. It wasn't there really when I started, because someone like John Nathan Turner, of course, who was one of who produced Doctor Who for 6 or 7 years. He didn't come from a script background. He was like me, a production manager who worked his way up in that way. And there were a number of producers who had that sort of production background when I started off. But gradually over the years, it shifted, and I can't put a precise finger on when it did shift, but it did shift sometime probably around the early 90s, when it became much more difficult to become a producer if you came from a production background. And it's still the same, really. I mean, there are a number of exceptions, and I've got friends who I'm very proud of who started as runners under me. Someone like Richard Burrell, for instance, who's a well-known producer now, and has worked his way up from there to being a major producer. And and Nigel Watson, who's just produced the latest series of Killing Eve, which has just come out. He was one of my early sort of trainees, and I've watched him work his way up over a long period of time to become a producer, and good luck to him. But with the majority of producers these days come from a script background, come from script editing, and it changed around about the mid 90s or early to mid 90s, and as more and more script editors became producers themselves, it's a question of perpetuating the people that and so consequently you felt that your successors, the people you were training up, were also going to be script editors. And so they became much more script focused. And that's really when the BBC felt it had to change effectively from associate producers, all this term, and come into line with the outside industry and create line producers and things.
So who would have been the people that you particularly learned from as you went to the BBC?
I worked a lot with a guy called Simon Curtis, who's quite well known as a director these days, film director. He directed my Week with Marilyn, and he's done quite a few things. Simon, I loved working with him, and I did he came from theatre. He came from the Royal Court, and I sort of started. It came very much as a novice, and myself and a guy called Glyn Edwards, who was a very experienced production associate producer, who taught me, who was one of the people that trained me. Glyn Edwards and Ros Anderson are the two people I sort of take as being my mentors, and people who I like to say I based my own style and everything on and learned the most from, because Glyn worked with Simon and I worked with Glyn, and so consequently I got to know Simon very well, and I did a lot of stuff with him. He kept the tradition of theatre going in the BBC for some time, up until the sort of mid 1990s, when basically multi-camera studios, apart from EastEnders and things like that, disappeared.
Well, of course, BBC continues to change and evolve, but I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time, Michael. I know we've but scratched the surface of your work, but clearly loved every minute, so thank you for talking to me about just some of those memories.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to remember some of it.